I hope that my lecture today gives you a new analytical framework to understand geopolitics. What I want is to give you the right tools and insights to understand this new geopolitical landscape, which is very different than the 1990s, the 2000s, and even from the 2010s. I think what the war in Ukraine illustrates is that we are living a new paradigm, and that the naive optimism of the 1990s is gone. Democracy, freedom, and prosperity will not come automatically. This is something that, for example, the historian Timothy Snyder calls the politics of inevitability. This will not come automatically. We need to fight for it. I think we live in a new paradigm, in a different geopolitical paradigm. The world that we're living now, democracy and freedom, is under threat. The authoritarians are on the march. What Putin did a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, is cruel, is immoral, is illegal. And these kind of actions we need to stop. The authoritarians are emboldened and confident, whether in East Asia, South America, or in Eastern Europe. And we need to do something about it. We need to do something about it so that the next generation can live in a more prosperous, freer, and more democratic world. A world where human rights are protected, economic freedoms are ensured, and human dignity is respected. Not just in a few countries, but in every country. Not just for a few people, but for every person. So let me begin my lecture with one question. Fundamental question for me, but I think for everybody. Why is the Maduro regime in Venezuela still in power? Why is it still in power? How did this regime survive years of tremendous protest? In 2014, in 2017, and in 2019, we protested for days and days and days, for months, nationwide protests, severe protests. We even won an election despite the frauds, an election that was then named unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. How did it survive years of maximum pressure, maximum diplomatic pressure? For example, when we established what we call the interim government in 2019, led by Juan Guaidó, over 60 countries, 60 states backed us, an unprecedented level of support for an interim government. How did the Maduro regime survive years of very comprehensive sanctions from the US and from the European Union? Since 2017, but especially since 2019, the US imposed broad sanctions against the Venezuelan regime, the Venezuelan state, industry-specific and sectorial sanctions against the Venezuelan oil industry, and also individual sanctions against hundreds of oligarchs, officials, and collaborators of the regime. How did the Maduro regime survive all of that? And of course, this question is, I'm applying it to Venezuela, but the same can be said about the Iranian regime of Ibrahim Raisi. The same can be said about even Putin in Russia, Lukashenko in Belarus, and of course, Díaz-Canel in Cuba. So why is Maduro still in power after all this pressure? There are three theories that people mention. The first one is to blame the opposition. They blame the fragmentation of the leadership. They blame the short-term thinking of the leadership. And they blame overall the erratic strategy. There are others who blame the international community. Some say that the international community did too much. Others say that the international community did too little. And there's a third explanation, which basically blames the people, that we were not up to the task, that we did not woke up soon enough to a dismantling of our democratic institutions. All these arguments are valid, I want to say. Yes, there were strategic mistakes. On the part of, for example, the opposition, yes, there were tactical and strategic mistakes. For example, in 2017, when we had like huge protests, the opposition incurred in negotiations that broke really the trust between the opposition leadership and their base. Now, after the fact, it's easy to analyze that we should have had a different strategy that did not involve demobilization of the people while we're negotiating. I think we can learn that, for example, from the Colombian negotiation process of Santos, in which he continued negotiations with the FARC without demobilizing in other fronts, similar to what Rabin did in Israel when he was negotiating with Arafat. Yes, maybe the Venezuelan society could have done more as well. And yes, there are problems of the international community strategy on Venezuela. The sanctions should have done and implemented in a more strategic way, in a more timely way, with more synergy between departments and with more synergy between governments. However, as mentioned above, all these actors make considerable efforts towards making a transition in Venezuela. They did, as I mentioned. So instead of analyzing them and their deficiencies, I will propose another explanation. I will propose an explanation that I think is more accurate, an explanation that I think illustrates not only the situation of Iran, Hong Kong, Nicaragua, Belarus, etc. It also illustrates a terrifying fact, which is that in the 21st century, there has been virtually no transitions from autocracy to democracy. What are our examples of transitions? Mostly in the 1980s or 1990s. For example, Pinochet in Chile, Franco in Spain, and of course, all the countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. But where are our modern examples? Even worse, what we are seeing in this period of democratic recession is that weak democracies are turning into autocracies. Examples like Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary. So what is this other factor that I want to talk today? You see, the title of this lecture is The Foreign Policy of Authoritarian States. Specifically, my argument is that the reason that the Maduro regime is still in power is because of its close connections with other authoritarian regimes, mainly four: China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Together, these regimes are forming what I call an authoritarian community of states, or an authoritarian network, in the following manner. These regimes have their own military alliances and shared training. They have their own diplomatic channels and collective agendas at the United Nations and at other multilateral institutions. They're designing their own financial ecosystem outside the scope of the US dollar and American-based institutions. They're developing their own energy policy, especially since most autocracies are resource-rich economies. As the political scientists in the room will say, there's a relationship between autocracy and being a resource-rich economy because of the dynamics of the political economy. They have a coordinated communications and propaganda machinery. They share information on how to avoid sanctions. This is a crucial point. They share methods for civilian surveillance. They share mechanisms to exercise electoral fraud, and the list goes on and on. In fact, I don't want to forget to say they shared methods of treatment of political prisoners, which is one of the horrible things that happened in my country. So my argument is that thanks to this authoritarian network, thanks to this connection, then we are seeing that these authoritarian regimes from Venezuela, from Maduro, Lukashenko, Ortega, Díaz-Canel, this is why they are strengthening their grip on power. And more importantly, this is why they are increasing their international influence as well. Among the characteristics of this authoritarian alliance is that there is not a unifying ideology behind them. Of course, much different than the Cold War in this regard. This is something that, for example, the Polish-American historian and journalist Anne Applebaum emphasizes. Because ultimately, what are the ideological commonalities between Maduro's socialism, Raisi's theocracy, and Putin's nationalism. There are not many. Instead, what truly unites them is their desire to maintain power. Internationally, this leads to two specific foreign policies. The first one is that they work together at undermining the current rules-based international system, proposing the adoption of a multipolar world where universal values of liberal democracy are no longer seen as universal. This is, for example, clear at the United Nations, when you have, for example, China proposing and trying to change the basic concepts that the international community has established. For example, they change the language of human rights for a language of sovereignty. And this is very clear. For example, when we go and we see that the Human Rights Council at the United Nations had 2/3 of its members are autocracies. It's astonishing. The second foreign policy result of this alliance is that these regimes work really hard on maintaining their coalition, on supporting each other. Because similarly to, for example, when we understand economic globalization these days, because our economies are very interconnected, then under globalization, one economic shock in one country transferred to another country. Similarly, because all these authoritarian regimes are somewhat connected, they work very hard to maintain the coalition, because one shock to one authoritarian regime can lead to another shock in another authoritarian regime. Because ultimately they share investments, loans, diplomatic agendas, kleptocratic networks, etc. I want to put a parenthesis. It is really interesting, and I don't have data to back this up, but it's really interesting that every time there's mass protests in one nation, one authoritarian nation, there are also mass protests in other authoritarian nations. We saw it with China and Iran, and in fact, I remember that when I was in Venezuela in 2014, and we were protesting every day against the Maduro regime, and then the Ukrainians were protesting every day in Euromaidan against Yanukovych. So to understand how authoritarian regimes cooperate, let's begin by explaining how the Maduro regime has been able to overcome the consequences of the US sectorial sanctions against Venezuela's oil industry. Maduro has done this thanks to two key partners, China and Iran. In regards to Iran, what Tehran is doing is helping Maduro regime transport oil and fuel through mechanisms outside the scope of US sanctions. This relationship began in 2019, when Venezuela had a severe nationwide shortage of fuel. So Tehran helped Caracas by sending not only fuel, but also blending agents to support the collapsing oil and fuel production. In return, Venezuela gave Iran control of key refineries and gave Iran involvement of the oil sector as a whole. So in that regard, then the Iranians, what were helping the Venezuelans is with the logistics of transporting oil and fuel outside the scope and outside the enforcement of US sanctions. Now in regards to China, Beijing is now purchasing most of Venezuela's oil. All of it through a series of phantom companies, that is, firms without any track record or clear ownership. These companies then hire anonymous tankers to carry the load and sell it with normalcy. This is why Venezuela's oil exports have more than doubled in relation to its lowest point in 2020, when the US sanctions were striking very hard. And this is not exclusive to Venezuela. China is doing the same with Iran. Most of Iranian oil is being sold by China. So in effect, thanks to China and Iran, then all the consequences of the US sanctions on Venezuela's oil have been basically overcome. Similarly, since the US has blocked countries like Iran and Venezuela from their economic sphere, these rogue regimes are forming their own economic ecosystem outside the scope of US sanctions. For example, they do this by giving preference to their companies when they give concessions instead of American or, for example, European companies. For example, most of the investment going on in Venezuela right now is being carried by Turkey and by Iran. They also help each other with credit when they need it the most. For example, Venezuela for years had a subsidized subsidized oil program to other partners in the region called PetroCaribe, when they gave oil at a very discounted rate. And in fact, even in the middle of the crisis in Venezuela, Venezuela gave over $400 million worth of oil to Cuba. And right now, Venezuela is relying on Chinese and Russian credit to overcome the crisis. Another example is how the Maduro regime has been sending gold to Mali via Russian planes. The gold is refined in Mali and sold in the United Arab Emirates. According to this report, this scheme has allowed the Venezuelan regime to earn profits of over $1 billion. Another well-known area of cooperation is in the security and military realm, which is very crucial. For example, it is widely reported that the Syrians, the Russians, and the Cubans have intelligence is heavily infiltrated into the Venezuelan military. The problem is that this blocks any possibility of a democratic transition if the military is not with a transition. It is also known that the police force in Venezuela is heavily infiltrated by the Cubans and the Syrians. For example, there is an episode where a Venezuelan commercial plane was seized in Argentina because its crew members were identified as members of Iran revolutionary forces. Because of it, then the airplane was stopped in Argentina and seized. This was a commercial airplane, and this is a national security concern. Propaganda is another area where these regimes cooperate. This is something that, for example, I saw when I came back to Venezuela in 2020. I realized how most of the narratives that were spread by the Russian regime were the same narratives that were spread in Venezuela's Twitter, WhatsApp group, and social media as a whole. They were really influencing Venezuela's public opinion. Similarly, Venezuela's regional television network, Telesur, has been propagating Russia and China's propaganda in relation to COVID and the vaccine. As mentioned, the list goes on and on. The Cubans have helped Venezuela in designing their fraudulent electoral system. The Cubans have advised Venezuela's diplomatic tactics. The Cubans have helped Venezuela distribute power across the military and intelligence forces so that no unit has enough power to topple the regime. So this is the situation that we have right now. Is that in most important governance aspects, the Venezuelan regime is receiving incredible support from this network of autocracies. Much of a greater support that, for example, the opposition has received from the international community. And this is why I believe that what we need to do is to have a new policy prescription, a new set of policy prescriptions to advance democracy and freedom internationally. The first one, we, members of the opposition or activist forces, we need to realize that we are not just fighting against our own respective states. The opposition in Iran is not fighting against the Ayatollah. We are not fighting against Maduro. The Nicaraguans are not fighting against Ortega. We are fighting an international autocratic regime, an international autocratic network of regimes, that in our case, one of its partners is in Caracas. The second thing, we have therefore a need for activist movements to connect with each other. We have little to no connectivity between activist movements in Zimbabwe, in Hong Kong, in Venezuela. And what we need to do is to develop a global network of activists where we have the possibility to exchange our know-how, when we have the possibility to exchange of strategies, and when we have the possibility to work in synergy. For example, if one activist movement has been very successful at lobbying, and another activist movement has been very successful at humanitarian aid, then we need to find ways that their know-how and their capabilities are connected. Third, if the US sees Iran, Russia, and China as a national security threat, then the Biden administration cannot normalize relations with the Venezuelan regime. Because if the Venezuelan situation is not resolved, then what we are guaranteeing is that then we have a hub, an authoritarian hub, very near the American border. The Russians are established in Venezuela. The Iranians are established in Venezuela. So if we consider them a threat to national security, then the Biden administration cannot normalize relations with Maduro for the sake of oil and of businesses, because they believe that with the war going on in Eastern Europe, then they can change the supply from there to Venezuela, which is a mistake, by the way, because the Venezuelan regime does not have the capacity to increase production marginally. Fourth, I believe that the United States should focus on strengthening its relationship with Latin America. Both the US and Latin America would greatly benefit from having a stronger and more economically interconnected American continent. It should be a priority of the United States to revert the current trend that we have, in which China and Iran are colonizing the region. Since 2005, China has invested over $150 billion in the region, over $140 billion in loans as well. And 2/3 of this investment goes to particular nations, what is known as the ALBA countries, countries like Venezuela. If the US do not do this with Latin America, then there will be more Venezuelas. There will be more failed states. Right now, the US does not have the capacity to, for example, turn Venezuela into a democracy in the short run. But what we need to ensure, the international community, is that these fragile democracies become strong democracies. And one way of doing it is by really having the priority in strengthening a Pan-American alliance in the region. I believe that this should be a priority in the foreign policy of the United States that is highly achievable. We Latin Americans share same religion, same language. We have also a very youth, hardworking population, peaceful population. We have no wars in Latin America. Why we don't become the main ally of the US? This is something that we need to change through, for example, cultural diplomacy, investment projects in Latin America, and a bottom-up approach to the region. Similarly, fifth, similarly to the way authoritarian regimes prioritize themselves commercially, we need to do the same. And we cannot repeat mistakes, such as, for example, the mistake that Germany did, which is that you cannot rely most of your energy or your natural gas on a country like Russia. You simply cannot do that. Because if you do, then you don't have any kind of strategic autonomy, which is the concept that Europeans love to talk about. So what we need to do is that our supply chains need to be overwhelmingly in the West and in the democratic region. Sixth, we need to understand that there are no international rules unless somebody enforces them. This is why stepping up in Ukraine was so important. We cannot go back to the days where authoritarian regimes simply annexed territory. We cannot go back to 1939. We cannot go back to the times in which we have wars every few years. Putin invaded Ukraine last year because this war did not begin last year. For years, you know this, for years, since 2014, Putin took parts of Ukraine, and the international community did not do anything about it. Not only Crimea, but the Donbas region, the war in Georgia as well. So this is something that should have been prevented if we had a stronger line before with Putin. And this is why I believe it is extremely important that the Ukrainians win this war. Because in their future, I think it relies a major chunk of the future of the world. If Kiev had fallen last year, then what would be the situation right now, for example, in the other Eastern European countries? What would be the situation also with Taiwan? It would be a really difficult situation. And finally, 7, I want to remind the audience, those of you, for example, that are Americans, that the fight for a free and democratic world is not just in conflict political zones like my country, or in war zones like in Ukraine. The fight for freedom is also here in the US, in Europe, and in the West. These systems, the systems of democracy and freedom, are extremely fragile. We know that, and the authoritarians also know that. That's why Putin pays so many journalists in Italy or here in the US. That's why my regime, the Venezuelan regime, has paid so many political parties in Spain, for instance, because they know that they can undermine our system, and they know that their biggest threat is not NATO. Their biggest threat is not sanctions, it's ideas. Putin invaded Ukraine because he could not stand that the Ukrainians were fighting in 2014 in Euromaidan for freedom and to join the EU. That's what they were fighting for. It was never about NATO. It was about their freedom. So the best way for us, for Americans, for Europeans, to help people like us in Venezuela is to protect your system, is to protect your democracies. This is the way that all of us can ensure that the next generation has a freer future, a freer world, which is what I believe all of us should strive for. This is the cause that, for example, has guided my life since I can remember. And this is the cause that I invite you also to join. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. Questions? Yeah.
Okay, did you want me to field them, or do you just want to take over?
I can take over.
You can take over.
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
So let me maybe start with the first one and then
Sure.
defer to my audience. So thank you very much. A big one that I have is put on my political science hat. Have that PhD from many years ago. I loved your very empirically grounded, detailed analysis of how authoritarian states cooperate, presumably in this, and you focused only on the foreign policy realm.
Yes.
The democratic states will do the same in many ways. Maybe not, certainly one hopes not torture political prisoners, but certainly there's collaboration between New Zealand and the United States on, China, for example, or Australia and England. So, or likewise with, other meetings and strategies and alliances. So what is, just again, to be really a bit more theoretical to push you at this point,
Right.
define your terms. So what is a democratic system? What is an authoritarian system? Right. Tell us a little bit more you could also say, and I'm not averse to this, you know one when you see one, and that's how I usually operate, but since we are in a scholarly setting, just tell us a little what makes a United States democratic and China authoritarian. Okay.
I think that the best way to classify systems of government is you have on the freer side what we call liberal democracies. Liberal democracies is where systems in which people have political rights to elect their leaders, free elections, human rights that are protected by their constitutions, so they are not governed, they are not subject by the rulers. They have a constitution that protects their rights. Those are liberal democracies. In the middle, we have what we could call illiberal democracies or failed or weak democracies, which is what, for example, most Latin American countries have, which are systems in which you have normally or officially, you have elections, but in this system, the constitutions do not work very well.
Would you put Brazil in that category, just to give us a sense?
Yes, I will put Brazil in that category. I will put countries like Bolivia as well in that category. And then on the far other end of the spectrum, you have authoritarian regimes. And these are regimes where fundamentally you don't have your human rights protected. In a normative way, by a constitution, you may have it, but not on an institutional way. In a country like mine, if the regime takes me to jail, then I have no right. I don't have a fair trial. In these systems, you don't have the opportunity to vote. In a country like Russia, then somebody like Boris Nemtsov is just killed on the street, or somebody like Navalny is just imprisoned. So in this sense, these are authoritarian regimes because there's no political rights, human rights, no any right. And that's the major difference. What is tricky is situations such as Hungary, for instance, or Turkey, where they're not full autocracies, but what they are is that they are failed democracies or mixed regimes. And I think placing where is the difference between the two, I think it's where in a country like mine, there's virtually no human rights. Any other question? Yeah.
Just to the whole argument here.
Sure.
Someone might say, look, the longest, most stablest countries in the history of the world are in the East.
Right.
Russia, sure, there's a change of government, but it's almost a continuous history of despotism. China, again, you have superficial changes of government, but certainly the impressive unity going back as far as the memory man, the despot from government. And when you look at the West, what you see is the novelty of free government. I mean, England is, I guess, the oldest running free government, and then that, changed over just in recent history, one can say, late 1600s, let's say, call it that. So constitutional monarchy. So the evidence about the longevity of these governments is still up in the air compared to despotism, is one. Two, also, it's a restricted environment. In other words, if you're talking about Latin America, we don't even see that kind of brief life that we have in the Western Europe and the United States and Canada. What you have is a cycle of military dictatorship, populist governments take over based on extreme popular anger and so forth. And so, for instance, someone may point to Venezuela and say, well, the fault of what happened in Venezuela is indeed the people, because Chavez was popular. He was a popular man, and he is the one who certainly brought about the transition to authoritarian government that Maduro then built up. So given that, then does that policy really make sense of hoping for enduring democracies in all over the world? I mean, maybe we should be more modest in our expectations. Is what I'm saying. And so the United States before had the policy of support of authoritarian governments.
Yes.
Americans, Somoza, Batista, Pinochet. I mean,
yeah, Trujillo. Yes, that's an excellent question, because it is very frustrating in Latin America, as you say, that not only we have lived in an eternal transition between democracy and autocracy back and forth, but even democracies become very volatile. Every government that we have, then the policy is completely different. And every government that we have, then it tries to take over the whole political system. There is not like a consensus. Because the difference is that, for example, in liberal democracies, the underlying assumption is that both sides have to reach a consensus within the rules of the game. In Latin America, basically what both sides try to do is to win over the entire institutional framework. Your first question about, for example, how democracies have been a short experiment, and mostly a failed experiment, sadly, is that, and this is my problem with, for example, the 1990s thinking, in which they thought that freedom and democracy was the end point of history, as was famously said, that it was inevitable to reach that point. I believe quite the contrary. The tendency, the structural tendencies that we have in our political economy, especially in countries like mine, resource-rich countries, the tendency is to have autocracies. The tendency is to have volatile, or not volatile, but unfree political systems. The only way, or the only thing preventing that, is precisely our rationality, precisely our willingness to develop institutions that try to control power. From a structural perspective, in a country like mine, where all power is centralized on the state, because the state is the owner of all the resources of oil, then it is really difficult to have a democracy. However, we have to try, because otherwise, then we are all doomed into a very horrible situation. And this is why when you said that, yeah, maybe we should not strive to have democracy, I believe in that. I believe in democracy. What we need to do is to take these factors into consideration, which I think was the problem of the 1990s. This idealism, this naive optimism, that the forces of history were in our favor, that the arch of history, as Kant used to say, was in favor of liberal democracy. I believe is quite the opposite. And the only thing preventing us is really us. Otherwise, the structural tendencies, the political economy, even human nature in itself leads to radicalism, and to populism, and to extremism. Especially in a region like Latin America. Poverty in the US and in the developed world is really different than poverty in Latin America. In our systems, we have the vast, overwhelming majority of the population excluded from the process of wealth creation. We have intolerable levels of inequality and economic poverty, of misery, human misery. Most people in my country do not have electricity, don't have a toilet. Most people in my country don't have enough food for their families. That's a reality. So when that happens, then the political result of that is that we have very unstable political systems. Because every 4 years, you will have a messiah that is telling you that everything will be fixed if I get into power. Everything will be fixed if I can break you from these ruling elites that are corrupt and that are inhibiting you from arriving into wealth and a decent living. So that's why our countries are very susceptible to radicalism and to populism. And my solution, or my idea, is that for a country like mine to truly have democracy, we first, or simultaneously, we need to find ways that the market institutions and the economic institutions are not just for a few, but reach every household. Most people in my country do not have a bank account. They don't have property rights to their home. Most people do not have access to even security, collective security. In countries like ours, people know that the police will not be there for them. And similarly, most disputes do not go to courts because the criminality is rampant. We live really in almost, or in my case of my country, in failed states. So until we solve that, then in Latin America we will not have stable democracies. It's not a matter of having more beautifully written constitutions. It's a matter of actually having the institutions reach the people, the institutions that make democracy stable. So that will be my answer to this question.
Can I just
Please do.
piggyback on this, the devil's advocate?
Yeah.
It seems to me when you're talking really about law and order, that I hear you speak more than democracy per se when I hear you sort of give those examples from your home country. So why not take the Singapore model, liberal authoritarianism, maybe not liberal, but some kind of authoritarian, but economic growth first, right? Stability, make sure people have toilets, food, et cetera, and then this election expanding of the franchise happens later. So maybe define your terms and maybe don't have such a lofty goal to have a massively, open to the masses democracy. Because even if you think about U.S., arguably its golden days were what, 1776 to 1900. The franchise was fairly narrow. I mean, arguably there was even maybe something like a racial apartheid until the 1960s. There was homogenous ruling elite. And now when we have democracy, now we're in real trouble too, because we're not thriving either. You can argue there's so much internal combustion going on here. So, what about the East Asian tiger solution, the authoritarian
Right.
model?
Yes. You want to
You're on
respond
the spot
or?
here, yeah, that's
Okay.
good. Okay, thank you. Then I'll shut up.
Okay. So basically, your argument is why we don't allow or encourage or embrace the idea of having some kind of liberal autocracy or benevolent dictator as a first step.
Yeah, yeah.
My counter-argument to that is how empirically correct it is to say that this process actually happens. How empirically correct is to say that this Singapore model is the norm rather than the exception of this process. Because what I tend to see, and I think what the data suggests, is that when you have extractive political institutions, such as the one that autocracies have, the result of that is also extractive economic institutions and social institutions. And that countries or examples like Singapore are rather the exception. But the rule is that, look at, for example, all the autocracies that we have in Africa. We don't see Singapore level of model there. And that will be my counter-argument. Many people, for example, made this prediction about China. They said that by the 2000s, China will be a democracy. Because this was example of the Asian tigers, as you mentioned. But it was not the case. So I think it's a very interesting debate. In Latin America, we have the example of, for example, Chile, a country that under Pinochet grew economically and then became a political system, an open political system. How replicable is that? I don't know. But again, from a normative perspective, I believe that human freedom is an encompassing value. That we need to have political freedom, economic freedom, and social freedom.
What would you consider a difference between a corrupt democracy and authoritarian system? It's not from Mexico. So back in Mexico, corruption is really, really bad. That at some point it feels like you live in an authoritarian system where it just brought me back when they had the local killings. It's like
Yes.
a lot of students got killed, like right side, because they protested against the government because of the Olympics, or they were hosting the Olympics. It gets to a point in which also the drug lords and narco gets involved in the system, that if you speak or you try to rebel against the government, you get killed.
Yes.
Women get killed. Ciudad Juarez became the most violent city in Latin America or Western Hemisphere, and it's just like, at some point, we don't really have freedom because of how corrupt is the system. So what would you think is the difference between a really corrupt democracy and an authoritarian system? Or is it kind of like the same or not? Like, what's the difference?
It's a very interesting question. And I was in Mexico a few months ago, and I could see the level of criminality that exists in some specific hotspot. I'm going to be in a few months in Colombia as well, similar situation. I remember when I was younger, when I was starting to study all these ideas, I was basically maybe 10 years ago, when I was 16, or less than that. I was watching an interview between the late Anthony Bourdain and Boris Nemtsov. And Anthony Bourdain, I think, asked a similar question, the one that you are asking. What is different? What is different about Russia? What Nemtsov said is that in all countries, you have corruption. In all these countries, corruption is indeed a problem, even in the US, even in Europe. The difference, talking about Russia, is that corruption in Russia is not a problem. It's a system. It's a political system. Corruption is not an accident, or corruption is not a part of the situation. Corruption is the core base of the system. In Venezuela, all the generals had ties with criminal activity. But this is not an accident. This is precisely what the glue of the entire system. Many opposition members are also part of the corrupt linked, but it is not an accident. This is part of the system. The same with the police, the same with the business elite. The business elite in Venezuela is corrupt, not by accident, by design. I think that's not the difference between autocracies and failed democracies, but I think it's a very important feature that really separates the difference between living in a corrupt autocracy like Russia and living in a corrupt place like other Eastern European countries or other Latin American countries where, again, there is corruption, like in the case of Mexico, like in the case of Colombia. More questions?
To what extent is all of this sort of driven by the rise of China? I mean, it's one thing to say that there always are democracies and autocracies, but now finally the autocracies have a market.
Yes.
I mean, it's one thing, in the past, if you're an autocratic country, you're just kind of poor and miserable to some extent. Just as some of these failed democracies are, but suddenly autocratic means rich.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, part of it is that it means effective, and maybe that only works in China, like to make it effective, rich, and autocratic. But nonetheless, for all these other autocracies, they have
A market.
a buddy.
I agree with you. Like, this is enabled in great by the China experiment. Similarly to, for example, the way the Cubans for many years lived by the wealth of Venezuelans because of the oil bonanza that we had. Without the Chinese, these authoritarian regimes will not have a natural market to, for example, sell oil. They will not have a natural market to, for example, get loans and get investments. Because yes, Russia has the GDP of Italy, barely. Venezuela is in collapse. The Iranians don't have as much money either. So this is really the main driver of at least the ability to have an economic ecosystem outside the West is China. So I agree with you. And this is something that has to be fixed. How? That's a very difficult question, but I agree with you 100%. More questions?
Who made this
No.
China policy?
Yes?
You spoke about the idea of how activist networks need to connect with each other
Yes.
across boundaries. And I'm just wondering, with a common feature of authoritarian governments is also internet repression, especially with
Sorry, what?
internet repression. The fact that they create controllable online spaces in a way where
Yeah.
citizens cannot interact with each other, much less with citizens across nations, right? So I'm just wondering, how is it that you see activist networks connecting with each other across boundaries
Yes.
when internet repression becomes a very common and usable factor? For instance, Uyghur Muslims in China can't even speak up against anything that's going on simply because of how repressed they are and how
Yes.
they don't have access to things that might connect them to other activists who might want to help them.
Yes.
Don't have-
Well, I can talk about that from personal experience. In the sense that I'm the director of an international NGO. My NGO, its name is Alumni for Liberty, and we have activists in over 100 countries. What we try to do is to give them the necessary training, skills, and tools so they themselves can try to transform their societies. We give them training on leadership, we give them training of management, we give them training on how to put together events or how to talk to journalists. We need to do more. For example, in authoritarian regimes, where there is a big possibility of being a political prisoner, we need to give them the tools, for instance, to how to avoid that situation. If they are in the situation, then how can we take them out of that situation? So we need to have, for example, an international network of human rights lawyers. Similarly, if there is a problem in one country, like let's say in Venezuela or let's say in Cuba, then we need activists from other countries to support that person. So that way, for example, let's say that in Venezuela we have a huge humanitarian situation. then activists in the US should help at, for example, fundraising money for those in Venezuela. And I think this list goes on and on. We have great books, we have great training that has to be translated into many, many languages. There is something also that we need to work on. And when you mention about, for example, censorship, online censorship, you are right. For example, we don't have members in China. We don't have members in Cuba because of that. But we do have members in, for example, Venezuela. And what we need to do is to connect these people. So that way they also brainstorm, so that way they have ideas. For example, I can talk from the perspective of the Venezuelan activism. We were really effective on lobbying efforts, diplomatic efforts, but for example, we were not really good on fundraising for our diaspora. We have over 7 million Venezuelans outside the territory, and we fundraised, I think it was overall, only $300 million, when in comparison, the Syrians have fundraised, I think, $7 billion, or the Ukrainians have fundraised $10 billion. So this is something the Venezuelan diaspora and migratory crisis is heavily underfunded. So in these cases, I think what we need to do is to connect people so that way they can exchange know-how, they can exchange expertise, and that they can coordinate. It is not easy, but I think it is the right way moving forward. Because you will be astonished in how little connectivity there is between, for example, even the opposition of Nicaragua and the opposition of Venezuela, which you would believe that there's a lot of shared interest, and there is not. Much less if you say, for example, the relationship between the opposition in Nicaragua and the opposition in Zimbabwe or the opposition in Iran. Virtually no connection. What we try to do is to connect activists and to try to create this international community, and we can create a bottom-up approach to democracy promotion, because a lot of this, I think, is cultural diplomacy, what we have to do. No? Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Please join